What happens when a decorated American officer tries to force a British royal guard to salute him and fails? At first, it looked like a simple misunderstanding, a visiting colonel, a silent guardsman, but within minutes the tension turned into a public standoff in the courtyard of Buckingham Palace. One man spoke loudly, the other didn't speak at all. And yet, it was the quiet one who left the crowd in awe. This isn't just a story about military tradition, it's about power, discipline, and the kind of respect you can't demand, you have to earn. Here's what really happened when silence stood taller than rank. The black motorcade pulled through the main gates of Buckingham Palace with clinical precision. A still morning mist hung low, blurring the hard edges of stone and steel. As the lead vehicle slowed to a halt, the rear door swung open, and out stepped Lieutenant Colonel Richard Maddox of the United States Marine Corps. He didn't pause to take in the grandeur. His gaze swept over the royal architecture with thinly veiled disinterest. He adjusted his cap, squared his shoulders, and walked like a man who had no time for theatrics. Not here. Not in front of soldiers who, in his words, stood around like mannequins in costume. Palace staff moved briskly, whispering greetings and directing the delegation, but Maddox ignored the coordinator's outstretched hand. His boots echoed off the cobblestones as he made a direct line toward the guard. He slowed just enough to glance at the tall, silent figure in red and black uniform, the bearskin cap towering above. No movement, no acknowledgement. Maddox smirked. "So this is what passes for a soldier here," he muttered to no one in particular, just loud enough for the staff nearby to hear. Polished shoes, starched collars, not a trace of real service. To some, it might have seemed like harmless banter, an officer blowing off steam in an unfamiliar setting. But to the older veterans watching from the sidelines, the tone wasn't unfamiliar. It was the same kind of voice they had heard from men who believed rank came with entitlement. Men who had forgotten what service really meant. Inside the palace security booth, a staffer flinched. Not because Maddox had broken any rules, yet, but because they had seen this play out before. Words layered with quiet insults. Authority wielded like a weapon, and always the assumption that silence equals weakness. Back outside, Maddox turned to face the guard squarely. His expression hardened. "What are you waiting for, Sergeant?" he said, voice rising. "Salute me." Still, the guard didn't flinch. His eyes were fixed forward, jaw steady, hands motionless at his side. Every muscle in his body radiated control, not defiance, just unshaken duty. The crowd, mostly unaware at first, began to slow. Cameras shifted. A few murmurs broke through the tourist chatter. And yet, no one stepped in. Because that's how it often starts, when one man in uniform believes he's above protocol, above history, above respect. But this time, the man being tested wasn't just a ceremonial symbol. This time, the one being dismissed was the one holding the weight of discipline, memory, and honor. And in less than a minute, the balance of power in that courtyard would shift, because the man standing silent was not the one who'd be forgotten. Lieutenant Colonel Maddox circled slowly, the sound of his heels clicking in deliberate rhythm on the stone beneath him. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. His tone carried the authority of someone used to compliance, to obedience, to people moving the moment he entered a room. But the man in front of him didn't move. Sergeant David Barrett, member of the Queen's Guard, remained utterly still, eyes forward, shoulders squared, rifle vertical at his side. His face, visible beneath the shadow of the bearskin hat, betrayed no reaction. No flicker of annoyance, no trace of fear. Maddox leaned in. "Tell me, Sergeant, do they train you to stare, or is that something you learn from the mannequins in Harrods?" he said, barely concealing his grin. "Because where I come from, a soldier who refuses a lawful order is no soldier at all." Nearby, the palace coordinator shifted uncomfortably. "Colonel Maddox," she said carefully, stepping forward, "guards on duty are under strict ceremonial protocol. They're not to respond to." He raised a hand to silence her without even turning around. "No offense," Maddox said, "but I didn't come here to be told how tradition trumps discipline. I've buried men who stood in real combat. I've seen what honor looks like up close. And this," he gestured broadly at the silent soldier, "this isn't it." He took one more slow turn around Barrett, scanning every inch of the uniform like a critic examining a stage costume. What he didn't notice, or maybe chose to ignore, was the small crowd gathering just beyond the courtyard barrier. American tourists, British locals, embassy staff, and among them, a few older men and women with folded arms and steady eyes. They weren't just watching, they were remembering. Because they had seen this before. The belittling of duty because it didn't look like what someone expected. The dismissal of silence as weakness. The assumption that noise equals strength. One of them, Raymond Ellis, 75, leaned toward the woman next to him. He didn't take his eyes off Barrett as he spoke. "I've stood just like that," he said. "Saigon, 1972. Man spit at my boots because I wouldn't answer back. I didn't flinch then either. Some of us don't need to." The woman nodded, her eyes wet. She wasn't crying. She was remembering someone who never came back. Maddox, meanwhile, was still talking. "What's wrong, Sergeant?" he asked. "Afraid your little routine can't hold up to real scrutiny?" Barrett blinked. Once, then reset his focus. Nothing in his posture changed. And somehow, that silence, measured, deliberate, rooted in something deeper than words, began to feel louder than Maddox's voice. Inside the security office, a low conversation had begun to unfold behind soundproof glass. A junior officer had pulled up a service file, one quietly flagged with distinction. Not for misconduct, for valor. Sergeant David Barrett wasn't some new recruit pressed into ceremonial duty. He was a veteran of 4 overseas deployments. He had served in Kandahar, Mosul, Helmand, and finally Mali. His name was etched into 3 unit citations and 1 medal that few ever received while still breathing, the Military Cross. "He's not just a guard," one of the security supervisors muttered. "He's a soldier's soldier." But out in the courtyard, Maddox remained oblivious. He saw only the surface, red wool, brass buttons, immobile posture. He couldn't see the quiet injuries that had never made the reports. He didn't know that Barrett had dragged a wounded corporal through gunfire while under air assault, or that he had stood alone between a crowd of civilians and an IED-rigged vehicle, refusing to move until his squad evacuated the street. He didn't know. And truthfully, he didn't care. Because men like Maddox rarely ask what came before. They judge by what they see now. Across the barrier, a man named Harold Green stood with his arms crossed. He was 80, a Korean War survivor, and his breath caught as he looked at Barrett's eyes, focused, unreadable, unshaken. "That's the look of someone who's seen real fire," he whispered to himself. Beside him, his granddaughter asked what he meant. Harold didn't answer right away. He simply pointed. "His back's not rigid because he's trying to impress," he said quietly. "It's because he learned a long time ago that posture keeps you alive." Meanwhile, Maddox continued circling, tossing verbal jabs meant to provoke. He referenced real combat, real command. He cited his own record, 2 deployments, 1 advisory tour, a Bronze Star. But even in his boasts, something was unraveling. His tone had shifted from confidence to agitation. His jabs were no longer laced with smugness. They were sharper now, more desperate, like a man trying to wrest back control of a moment slipping away. Because something was happening that he hadn't planned for. The silence wasn't breaking. Barrett refused to acknowledge him. And that refusal, rooted not in defiance but in something far more disciplined, was doing what no insult could. It was exposing Maddox, wordlessly, publicly. Back inside, the head of diplomatic security reached for the internal phone. "We've got a situation that's about to tip," he said flatly. "One of ours is provoking a guard with battlefield clearance and standing honors, and the press is starting to notice." Outside, a child tugged at her father's sleeve, pointing to Barrett. "Why doesn't he talk, Daddy?" The father paused, looked, then answered carefully. "Because sometimes the most powerful thing a soldier can say is nothing." And in that moment, Maddox's voice, still echoing across the stone courtyard, began to sound oddly small. Lieutenant Colonel Maddox took 2 steps back, drew a sharp breath, and turned toward the gathering crowd. His voice, now more performative than confrontational, rose slightly, not in anger, but in declaration. "I want every American here to take a good look at this," he said, his hand gesturing widely toward Sergeant Barrett. "This is what we're supposed to respect? A man in a costume who won't acknowledge a senior officer?" The palace courtyard, once filled with the quiet awe of visitors, began to shift. Heads turned, phones raised, people whispered. Not because of what Maddox said, but because of the way he said it. Across the front row, a woman in her 60s, wearing a veteran's widow pin on her coat, clutched her purse tighter. Her late husband had served 3 decades in the British Army. She had stood beside him through 4 postings and knew the toll that silence sometimes exacted. Watching Barrett now, her fingers tensed. She'd heard that tone before, the voice that confused loudness for strength and ceremony for weakness. Maddox continued, "I served in real conflict. I've led men under fire. I've commanded units that bled in the dust, not paraded in palaces." His words, at first forceful, began to feel hollow, because something was shifting, not just in tone, but in presence. Behind the barrier, a man named Samuel Ortiz stood quietly. He was 72, a Vietnam vet who had walked into this palace with a group of fellow retired Marines. They had come to see tradition, but now he was watching a confrontation that reminded him of every time his service had been reduced to a uniform by someone who never cared to ask the story behind it. He looked at Maddox, then at Barrett, then down at his own shoes. "I've had friends who couldn't talk for weeks after coming home," he said softly to the man next to him. But they stood like that, back straight, eyes steady, because it was the only way they knew how to hold on. Maddox took one more step forward, now facing both the guard and the onlookers. "If this is what passes for military discipline, maybe we've got bigger problems than I thought." He turned to the palace coordinator, who stood silent, eyes wide, helpless to interrupt. "Do you condone this?" A uniformed soldier refusing a direct command from an Allied officer, but no one answered. Because by now, even those unfamiliar with protocol could feel it. This wasn't a lapse in discipline. This was restraint, measured, purposeful, anchored in something deeper than pride. And that contrast between noise and resolve was beginning to show. Not in debate, but in silence. Sergeant Barrett hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, hadn't even breathed heavily. And somehow in that stillness, it was Maddox who looked increasingly out of place. It happened without warning. 1 second, Maddox was gesturing mid-sentence, clearly frustrated that no one had backed him. The next, his hand reached out and brushed the edge of Sergeant Barrett's sleeve. A gasp rippled through the crowd. It was a light touch, quick, barely more than the flick of 2 fingers against polished wool. But everyone who had ever worn a uniform knew what had just occurred. Maddox had crossed a boundary not written in any tourist guide, but carved deep into the marrow of military tradition. You do not touch an active-duty guard on post. Not in jest, not in protest, not even in correction, and especially not to provoke. Barrett didn't react immediately, but something shifted, subtle, yet unmistakable. His fingers curled ever so slightly around the rifle at his side, his weight adjusted, neither in threat nor fear, but in readiness. From the sidelines, one of the senior palace guards, an older man named Corporal Jenkins, took 1 step forward, lips parting, as if to intervene. But he stopped, because Barrett still hadn't broken form. Not yet. Maddox didn't seem to grasp the severity, or maybe he did, and didn't care. His voice dropped to a growl. "Now salute me," he said, his words no longer theatrical but personal. "Or I'll make sure this ends in a report your superiors won't like." Silence. The palace staff stood frozen, their training telling them not to interfere, but their instincts screaming otherwise. A few visitors lowered their phones. What had started as a tense moment was now something else entirely. It felt like watching a line being trampled, and not just between 2 men, but between institutions, between respect and ego, between self-control and entitlement. On the far edge of the crowd, a woman named Grace Allen whispered to her husband. She was 74, a retired military nurse who had served in field hospitals during the Gulf War. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but fury. "He touched a man on duty," she said. "That's not just disrespect, that's aggression." Her husband nodded, his eyes narrowing. Back then, something like this could have started a brawl. But he pointed toward Barrett, he's holding the line for both of them. Across the courtyard, the atmosphere had thickened. Even the pigeons seemed to have quieted. And in that heavy stillness, it became clear. Maddox wasn't testing Barrett's obedience. He was testing whether anyone, anywhere, still believed in the value of doing things the right way. And Barrett, through breath held and muscles braced, was answering. Not with fists, not with words, but by not breaking, by standing again for more than just ceremony. Inside the security room, the head liaison made a swift call to the embassy. "You need to know," he said into the receiver, "your officer has just put his hand on one of our active guards, and the only reason this hasn't escalated is because the man he touched has more restraint than most men twice his rank." Back outside, Maddox's hand dropped. He took half a step back. But the damage had been done. Barrett's silence was no longer just protocol. It was resistance. The quiet kind. The kind built not on defiance, but on discipline. The kind of response that doesn't flare up in heat, but holds steady in the face of it. And now, everyone watching understood what was really happening. A man in uniform had tried to assert dominance through noise, and the man he tried to diminish had replied without moving a muscle. Sergeant David Barrett didn't move right away. His silence stretched for another few seconds, long enough for the tension to tighten, for the crowd to lean in, for even the air to feel heavier than it had moments before. Then, without a glance to the side, without shifting his feet or relaxing his grip on the rifle, he spoke. "Sir." One word. Crisp, controlled. It landed like a weight dropped into still water. "I am currently on duty under ceremonial protocol issued by the Household Division of the British Armed Forces," he said, his voice clear but never raised. "Per standing orders, I am not permitted to respond to foreign officers, regardless of rank, unless such engagement is initiated through the official chain of command." Maddox narrowed his eyes, but said nothing. "I do not serve under NATO authority while on this post," Barrett continued. "I do not serve the United States. I do not serve public opinion, nor do I serve emotion. I serve the Crown. And in this role, I am to remain silent, still, and unshaken unless ordered otherwise by my commanding officer." He paused. "That is not defiance. That is structure." There was no aggression in his voice, no pride, no need to dominate the moment. He was simply explaining what Maddox had refused to understand, that some lines are drawn not to divide men, but to uphold something larger than either of them. Barrett inhaled once, slowly. His posture never changed. But now the stillness felt different, not passive, but anchored, not theatrical, but earned. "This uniform," he said, "has stood here long before either of us put on rank, and when I leave, it will be worn by another. That continuity is not weakness. It is legacy, and legacy must be protected by discipline, not volume." No one spoke. No one even breathed too loudly, because what had just been said didn't need embellishment. It wasn't an argument. It was a boundary drawn with the authority of principle. At the back of the courtyard, an older man named Clarence Hughes quietly wiped his eyes. He was 81, a black veteran who had once been posted in Berlin, guarding embassy grounds while protesters hurled slurs at him daily. He turned to the younger man beside him, a grandson perhaps, and whispered, "That right there? That's a soldier. Not because he fought, but because he knows when not to." The younger man didn't answer. He just nodded, slowly, because there was nothing else to say. Maddox, standing a few feet away, felt it too. The shift. The sudden realization that he had misjudged the moment. That his rank didn't carry weight here. That the crowd wasn't on his side. And most disorienting of all, that the man he tried to provoke had never once tried to fight back. And yet, somehow, Barrett had won something far greater than applause. He had preserved the line. The kind of line that holds institutions together. The kind of line that makes strangers across the world watch a silent soldier and feel something stir in their chest. Not admiration, but respect. Just as the courtyard began to settle, just as it seemed the moment might fade into silence again, a door near the palace entrance opened, and a senior officer in dress blues stepped out. Captain Jonathan Wells, liaison officer to the royal household and commanding supervisor of the guard rotation, walked forward with deliberate calm. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush. He simply approached the line, stood beside Barrett, and addressed the crowd, not to perform, but to clarify. "For the benefit of our visitors," he began, "allow me to confirm that Sergeant Barrett has acted entirely within standing orders issued by both this post and the military code of conduct." He glanced toward Maddox, not with disdain, but with the quiet firmness of someone accustomed to restoring order without fanfare. "Ceremonial guards are not under obligation to acknowledge foreign command structures while on active watch. Their loyalty, in this context, is to the Crown and to the integrity of post protocol. This ensures the sanctity of neutral ground and prevents politicized engagement within the sovereign space of the monarchy. He let that sit. No elaboration. No lecture. Just facts. Then he added, "Had Sergeant Barrett broken posture to salute you, Colonel, that would have been a breach of his orders, one for which he would have been disciplined." Captain Wells turned back to Barrett and gave the slightest nod. Barely perceptible, but unmistakable. A silent commendation. A way of saying, "You did exactly what you were meant to do." In the crowd, an older woman named Diane Lowell, a retired Air Force administrative officer, exhaled slowly. She had held back her opinion all afternoon. But now, as a commanding voice confirmed what her instincts had already told her, she let it settle deep. "That's what leadership looks like," she said mostly to herself. "Not yelling, not grandstanding, just protecting the right man at the right time." Beside her, her husband nodded, eyes still locked on Barrett. "It takes a lot to stand your ground," he murmured, "but it takes even more for someone in command to back you when you do." Back on the courtyard stones, Maddox shifted. He looked at Wells, at Barrett, at the crowd, who were now watching him with a quiet that didn't feel passive. It felt observant, evaluating, and he realized, perhaps for the first time in his career, that his rank wasn't enough to carry the room. That respect couldn't be demanded from a man who had earned it by standing still under pressure. That silence, when anchored in discipline, could make even decorated voices sound hollow. Wells didn't linger. He gave a polite nod to the crowd, stepped back in line, and let the courtyard return to its still rhythm. But something had changed. Barrett hadn't been defended. He had been affirmed, by the very system Maddox thought he could override. Colonel Richard Maddox stood still for a long moment, as if waiting for someone, anyone, to step forward and justify what he had just done. But no voice came to meet his silence, no face turned in empathy. Even the members of his own delegation kept a careful distance, their body language unmistakably neutral. He looked around, eyes scanning for allies. What he saw instead were lowered brows, folded arms, and the kind of quiet only reserved for those who have gone too far and realized it too late. He opened his mouth as if to speak, to reclaim control, explain himself, soften the edge he'd carved too deep. But nothing came out. Because deep down, he knew. This moment could not be walked back with a sentence. He straightened his posture, more from habit than conviction, and began to step away from the guard. No one moved with him. At the edge of the crowd, Colonel Adrienne Wilson remained still. Decorated, respected, and perhaps the most senior officer present after Maddox himself, she didn't follow him. Instead, she stepped forward, just enough for her presence to be registered. She didn't speak to Maddox. She didn't speak to the crowd. She turned toward Barrett, her uniform crisp, her demeanor calm, and without fanfare, she offered a single, deliberate nod. It was the kind of gesture only soldiers give one another when there are no words, when shared experience and mutual respect render language unnecessary. Then, to the palace liaison beside her, she said quietly, "The sergeant has demonstrated commendable restraint. That kind of discipline doesn't happen by accident. It's earned." Behind her, several other American officers gave subtle gestures of agreement. Hands on hips, slow nods, weight shifted forward. No one applauded. No one smiled. But something had settled. Colonel Maddox, now a few paces away, paused as if expecting some reversal, some sign that the tide might still shift his way. It didn't. He adjusted the cuffs of his coat, eyes flicking sideways, and walked alone across the courtyard. His footsteps echoed faintly, but even the sound of his exit couldn't break the stillness he left behind. Because the attention wasn't his anymore. It was still centered on Barrett. Barrett, who hadn't moved, who had spoken once with clarity and returned to his post, who never needed to raise his voice or his hand to reclaim what had nearly been taken from him, respect. At the back of the crowd, Samuel Ortiz stood quietly, arms folded across his chest. The old Marine veteran hadn't said a word since the incident began. But now, watching Maddox disappear into the palace, he turned to the stranger beside him and said with soft finality, "That man didn't just follow protocol. He reminded all of us what real command looks like." The stranger didn't respond, only nodded, then glanced at Barrett with a different kind of gaze. Not curiosity, not awe, recognition. In the corner, a young boy holding a tiny Union Jack flag looked up at his grandfather and asked, Why didn't the soldier yell back? The old man smiled faintly. Because people who know they're right don't have to shout. The boy nodded slowly, as if that lesson would stay with him for a very long time. And across the square, every quiet breath, every steady gaze, every still moment now carried the same unspoken truth. Barrett hadn't won an argument. He had preserved a principle. And in doing so, he hadn't embarrassed a visiting officer. He had reminded a nation, and perhaps a few watching others, that dignity, once lived fully, doesn't need to be defended. It just needs to be seen. The courtyard at Buckingham Palace had returned to its formal rhythm. The ceremony moved forward as planned. Guards exchanged posts, staff reset their routes, tourists resumed their photos, though more slowly now, more contemplatively. But there were still a few who hadn't moved. An older couple stood near the iron fence, holding hands without speaking. A retired officer leaned against the stone pillar, but his chest rising and falling with that familiar steadiness, the kind of breath you take when something true just happened. And at the center of it all, Sergeant David Barrett finally stepped out of formation. His relief had arrived. The young guardsman now standing in his place was freshly posted, clean-faced, unsure. But Barrett didn't offer instruction. He didn't need to. His example had already taught the lesson. He turned, taking long, even steps down the inner corridor that led away from the public eye. His boots didn't rush, his shoulders didn't sag, and the weight of what had just passed didn't burden his posture. It grounded it. The kind of walk that only comes after standing through something heavy and choosing not to bend. As he passed under the archway, Barrett didn't look back. But just before he disappeared from view, his eyes briefly met those of a young American tourist. Maybe 20, maybe a future soldier, maybe just someone who had come for pictures and found something else entirely. And in that look, something passed. Not a challenge, not pride, but permission. Permission to carry dignity without raising your voice, to stay rooted when someone tries to push you off course, to know that sometimes the greatest show of strength is refusing to perform. Inside the palace, Captain Wells watched from a distance, saying nothing. He didn't need to. Justice had already spoken, not with volume, but with precision. Colonel Maddox was gone. The delegation had moved on. There would be paperwork, of course, statements, diplomatic calls, but none of that mattered in the same way this moment would linger, because those who witnessed it wouldn't forget what it felt like to see a man disrespected, and see him win, not by retaliating, but by holding steady until the room remembered what respect is supposed to look like. No medals, no headlines, no need. Just the echo of footsteps and the quiet shift of hearts. And maybe years from now, someone in that courtyard, maybe that boy with the flag, maybe that veteran in silence, will be faced with their own version of this day, their own moment to choose stillness over spectacle. And maybe they'll remember him. The soldier who didn't raise his voice because he didn't have to. In a world where loudness is often mistaken for leadership, Sergeant Barrett's quiet strength reminds us that true authority doesn't need to shout. His silence wasn't passive, it was principled. His refusal to retaliate wasn't weakness, it was discipline. And in that, we're reminded of a lesson many have learned the hard way. That character is revealed not when things are easy, but when someone pushes you to break, and you don't. For veterans, for everyday working people, for anyone who's ever held their tongue to protect their values, Barrett's stand affirms that restraint can be more powerful than reaction. It also speaks to something deeper, that dignity is not given by others, nor taken away by insult. It is something we carry quietly in how we respond to disrespect. In our own lives, we may never stand in a royal courtyard, but we will all face moments where we're tested by arrogance, by unfairness, by noise. And in those moments, we can remember this. You don't have to win the crowd to win the moment. Sometimes all it takes is standing your ground, saying only what needs to be said, and letting the truth speak for itself. That kind of quiet courage, it leaves a mark no one can erase. Type 1 if you've ever been made to feel small by someone louder, someone higher ranked, someone who thought silence meant weakness. Type 2 if you believe integrity, discipline, and quiet strength still matter, and always will. If this story meant something to you, share it. Someone out there might need to remember that doing the right thing doesn't always come with applause, but it always leaves a mark. And if stories like this help you see the world a little clearer, subscribe for more. We tell the ones that don't make the headlines, but should have.